Welcome to the Trellix Spotlight series. My name is Nick, and I will be your host. Today's session will focus on hunting with Trellix XDR. This webinar will be recorded. If you prefer not to participate in the recorded session, please feel free to disconnect at this time. A link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. This webinar is a brief overview covering common use cases and scenarios regarding this topic. It is not intended to be all-encompassing. If assistance is needed, please contact Trellix Technical Support. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A window. This webinar may run longer or shorter based on your participation, and we recommend asking as many questions as you can to make the most of this series. If the Q&A window is not displayed, click the tab at the bottom of your session window and click on the Q&A icon. We will answer the questions during the final section of this webinar. If you experience any audio issues during the webcast, please drop and attempt to reconnect. Our presenter today is Sarah Cox. Sarah is an instructor and curriculum developer at Trellix with over 20 years of experience working in technology and security. While at Trellix, she is focused on digital forensics and incident response. Sarah has a passion for teaching and is also a faculty member in the Cybersecurity program at Merritt College in Oakland, California. When she's not working, she enjoys hiking, biking, and most of all, skiing. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Nick. It's a pleasure as always. I am delighted to be with you all here today to talk about hunting with XDR. We've got a lot to cover, and so I'm going to jump right in. I'm not sure, for the audience, I imagine we have a mix of folks who maybe have attended some webinars before, maybe are new to our webinars. So I will definitely start with introducing our Trellix XDR tool. I'll give a high-level overview of hunting, but really I want to dive into all of the activities that we can do within the platform XDR to execute hunt missions. So we'll be doing a lot of demos so that you can see these activities in the tool. We'll talk about things like baselining, and then I'll also walk through a hunt mission using some Cobalt strike indicators. I do want to mention, for those of you, if this maybe is your first time attending one of our Spotlight Series webinars, this is the third, I would say, in a series of webinars that we had covering the tools within our XDR ecosystem. I talked about, in a previous month, we talked about supercharging your search with XDR and Trellix query language, and my colleague Mike Kazarian did a great section on demystifying enterprise search. So if you're really new to those tools, I might recommend checking those out as well. I hope you'll find something interesting and useful in this in today's webinar as well. So for those of you that may be joining us for the first time, I do want to do a quick introduction of Trellix and XDR, essentially wanting to frame the conversation and the tool and what we provide through the lens of what analysts are seeing day to day and what their challenges are. So if we think about a traditional enterprise, we had network, endpoint, email, and data, and we had coverage across those, which is really important to get that visibility. But those were point solutions in a siloed architecture, and that really makes it difficult for the analyst to work through that data, right? There's friction in different logins. There's not easy to spot correlations. And so it's a little bit of a task to move through all that data. In our modern enterprise, we have coverage across those vectors of endpoint, network, email, and data as we need to have, but in a way that is seamless so we can move and sift through that data. We also see that the modern enterprise has evolved to include data centers and cloud workloads and remote workforces. And we need to have the data from all of those areas feeding our solution. More than just having our analyst ease of interacting with the data in a single tool that they can pivot through, we need our tools to work for us and correlate data. So if we have a detection on endpoint, we can correlate that with network activity to help out the analyst. So that leads us into understanding the benefit and power of XDR. XDR is an extended detection platform that reaches across vectors like we just saw, endpoint, email, cloud. And this is not only the native Trellix solution, but your third-party data sources. Those data sources are really important. Those are tools you have in your environment, and you need to have access to that data. Once we have that data, we can do detection and correlation across those vectors at the moment they arise. We can identify entities. We can identify a host name, and that a user that logs into an email, with sarah@trellix.com is the same as the user, Sarah, that logs into an endpoint. The tool can help identify that and speed and jumpstart what the analyst is looking at so that they can move into the craft of analysis and identification of threats and taking on those next steps. More than that, XDR allows us to take response actions to prioritize and respond to those attacks in real time and leverage those APIs and open integrations to automate actions. So here's a view of our Trellix platform. At the bottom of the screen here on the left, you can see our native XDR controls. We have endpoint covered through EPP, EDR, and Trellix Endpoint Security. We have network detection and response, DLP, our data loss prevention. And then on the right side, you see these open data sources represented. We've got data sources from the cloud, user entity information, firewall, lots and lots of data sources. At the moment, we have over 1,000 data sources represented that we can easily integrate. If you're connecting a cloud data source, it's often as easy as just filling out a template with the correct information. If it's an on-prem data source, you can point it at a collector and feed that up to our XDR solution. So we know how important those data sources that you already have in your environment are to having the full visibility and picture of what is happening. Those controls are feeding XDR and our XDR engines, which are doing advanced analytics, detection, orchestration, and driving automation. And then with all of that data in our console, we can identify threats, run incident investigations, leverage those open APIs, and build response workflows. I also want to call out on the right side here, we do see the Trellix Advanced Research Center represented. That's such an important piece of the puzzle. The Trellix Advanced Research Center consists of hundreds of experts, and those are data scientists, threat researchers, and software engineers. And that team has a mandate to generate cyber threat intelligence to power and research our products. And we're going to leverage some of that intel later on when we move into talking about our hunt mission. So we talked a little bit about Trellix XDR. I also want to talk a little bit about hunting. And with the short time that we have today, I am really just going to go through this quickly. Hopefully all of you are somewhere on your hunting journey. Maybe some of you are seasoned threat hunters and just want to know how to use our tools a little bit more efficiently. Maybe some of you have our tools and are interested in starting hunt programs or have dabbled in hunt activities, but want to make that a little bit more formalized. But all of us are here because we know hunting is essential to our security posture. We know that adversaries know how to to avoid traditional detection. And as we build detections, they respond with new activities. It's a cycle and it's hard to stay on top of. We don't want to passively wait for detection mechanisms because it leaves us always a step behind. Threat hunting allows us to search through our historical data to yield detections to look forward and detect forward. There are some other really important benefits to hunting. I think folks really naturally gravitate to proactively identifying threats, and that's a really important activity. But there are lots of benefits to having a strong hunting program. You build collaboration across teams that support each other. You can improve your security posture. If you're building out a hunt mission and trying to baseline activity and realize you haven't collected a key piece of data, you have an opportunity to correct that gap before you're working an investigation and need it. Your hunt missions are going to drive your internal intelligence and allow you to build out CTI specific to your own environment. And your threat hunting missions are going to enable your executive decisions. So there's some really fantastic outcomes from hunting beyond just proactively finding threats. Now today, as we go through, we're going to follow our hunting process. This is what we call the 4A hunting process. You might be familiar or use other processes that might have 5, 6 steps. They'll pretty typically flow with this. This is just essentially how we've captured this to organize our thoughts. Now, as we're going to go through our samples today, we have assessed and defined those hunt missions for you to jumpstart so that we can really get into the execution phase working with our tools. There's a lot of thought that goes into scoping those hunt missions and having those be driven by real cyber threat intelligence, your own vulnerability landscape with your environment. So this is not an activity that should be taken lightly. Only for the purpose of this presentation are we moving through it really quickly. Where we're going to focus our time is in the acquire and analysis phases, which we can conduct with our XDR tools. So we're going to search and acquire the data in our environment. And we have a couple of ways that we can do that depending on where the data is. XDR allows us to go and get the data there or aggregate it for quick and fast search in the console. And also through the API, we have integrations or automation options to take the data that we've acquired, streamline it, and make that analysis all the more efficient, right? So we want to make these hunt missions as efficient as possible. And then the last and final step is taking action out of those findings. And again, we often think of the benefit of hunting as finding some malicious actor in our environment and taking steps to contain and remediate that situation. And that is a really important follow-on action. But there are additional actions and outcomes that can come out of hunt missions that have a lot of value to your organization. Those are definitely worth talking about as well. For the purposes of today, we're going to leave it at that. In terms of defining your hunt missions, you'll see in the examples today that we are defining them in a way that is scalable, repeatable, sustainable, and measurable. And you'll see with our tools, they really support the ability to make them repeatable and scalable. In fact, as we conduct a hunt mission, we might find opportunities in the after action and reflection to refine it and make it even more automated, even more streamlined. That makes it more sustainable, and it makes it scalable because we can grow maybe the depth of the systems that we're searching or add new hunt missions. And then finally, we want our findings to be measurable. We want to be able to document our successes and promote the benefits of our hunting program. Now, a couple quick definitions before we jump in with our examples. I will use the term hypothesis or hunt mission throughout this presentation. We've had some internal discussions about, hypothesis-driven hunting. And when I'm using the term hypothesis, I really mean it in a more broad term. I really just mean the initial concept of what we're hunting for and how to find it. And this hypothesis must be testable. So if I think that an actor is in my environment using Cobalt Strike, I need to have some indicator, some data that is going to have been left that I can find to prove that was indeed the case. So we will talk about hypothesis-driven threat hunting or using hypothesis, but really what we're mostly looking at here is hunts built around TTPs or tactics, techniques, and procedures. And we can find these through various intel sources. We can find them through the MITRE framework, and essentially looking for the attack mannerisms and mechanisms that are used by attackers against us in our own environment. And so this is a really fruitful source. These techniques are fruitful sources to build out our hunt missions. All right, with that, I want to take all that we know now about XDR and about hunting and move into talking through taking some of these hunt mission actions in XDR. The first step that we'll need to understand is the baseline of activity in our environment. When we build a baseline, we define what normal looks like in our organization. If we don't know what normal looks like, we're not going to be able to find something that looks suspicious or is an outlier. So we need to understand what normal looks like for us. So let's take a really well understood attack technique to frame our discussion here about baselining. Let's imagine we wanted to hunt for abnormal RDP usage. RDP can be abused in our environment to gain access to systems, to move laterally, and it can also be used to exfiltrate data. So RDP can be tunneled through open channels for the purposes of C2. So there's a lot of different ways that we could define abnormal RDP usage. For the purpose of a hunt, we want to be specific enough that we can test it, right? So there, I listed a few there. Let's say we're looking specifically for tunneling RDP. Okay. Now, what's fantastic about RDP is it's an artifact that has a lot of data. We can look through network data and we can look through endpoint data for that. But we need to understand what normal looks like before we can look for abnormal, right? If I don't know what it looks like to have RDP in my environment, I will have no idea if something is expected or unexpected. So our first step is to baseline that activity. So how prevalent is RDP? What is it? What are common users? Is the RDP activity coming from common locations? And so we've got this data accessible in XDR, and we can use those tools to build dashboards or run searches to understand the baseline activity. What we see here is a dashboard built off of queries around our endpoint data. So we're leveraging Windows events. We're looking at the system events 4778, 4779, as well as the terminal services event log event IDs to see, how common is RDP. And we can see the source IPs here. So we're going to run this collection so we can understand what RDP looks like. Now, if you don't have a normal use of RDP in your environment, let's say your admins are using PowerShell, then this is not the great hunt mission for you. You would revise it, but then you could work one around PowerShell, right? So baselining PowerShell activity. Who are the normal admin users? Who's expected to use it? What locations are they using? Are there scripts that are run certain times of day? So this, hopefully this idea of baselining you can translate. And we're just leveraging this data from the console. We have in XDR all of this data. It's really easy to gather. Once we understand our baseline, we'll be ready to execute our hunt mission. And so again, as a reminder, we're looking for abnormal RDP usage. We can search in our network data. We can search in our Windows data. It really depends where we have that data, what tools we have within our XDR ecosystem. We've seen that XDR is broad and flexible. It supports many native and open controls. So you want to hunt where you're going to have the easiest access to this data. Now, in the training environment that we often use for demos, we're collecting a bunch of stuff right in the console. So we've got our NetFlow logs, really easy to search. You had full packet capture through NDR, search there. So the where to hunt is situational to your tool set or the specific configuration you have within XDR. If you are wanting to leverage the console and you have network security or Trellix packet capture, you can have those devices forward NetFlow events to XDR, and it makes that search all the more straightforward. So again, we can search on NetFlow or we can search on the Windows classes. So for this mission, I'm going to keep it kind of high level, abstract in the slides. In the next mission, we'll jump in and do these in the console itself. But you can see here the acquisition, if we've got this data aggregated, is very straightforward. We run a search for those IDs. We've got login type 10 ID for login type ID 10 here for RDP, and we've got this exclusion for this particular source IPv4. So from our baseline, we had identified we have a jump box, and so we're not concerned with data coming from that because we expect our admins to be using that. We want to see outliers. So that acquisition piece becomes really straightforward. This section here was really meant to talk about baselining. So now I'm going to move into talking about our hunt mission that we've defined. So we're going to use Cobalt Strike as our sample hunt mission. And for the intel, as I said, it's important when you're defining your hunt missions to have them based in the real world, in cyber threat intelligence, or your situational environment here. So I'm going to use our threat report, which came out February 2023, as my intel piece. Now, this is always a little bit odd for demo purposes because this is our Trellix intel. And so I know that this intel is feeding and informing our products. That's a really powerful benefit of our advanced research center team. On the other hand, I can't bring myself to use another threat feed as an example. So we'll stick with this one. In the February 2023 report, they talked a lot about Cobalt Strike activity. They shared some really cool insights into the hunting methodologies they had discovered. For example, they noticed a high number of those Cobalt Strike team servers were hosted in Chinese cloud providers, which I thought was super interesting. So there's some great insights in there if you want to check it out. The link will be at the end of the presentation here. All right, so in that latest threat report, as I said, they talked about Cobalt Strike quite a bit. One of the most interesting findings in there is that Cobalt Strike was the most prevalent malicious tool used by ransomware groups in Q4 of 2022. Of course, as they're writing the report in February, they have to look back to the previous quarter. And so obviously we are all concerned about ransomware. It's pretty indiscriminate. This is in all it's shared by all of us in our threat profile. So I think this is a good opportunity for a hunt mission that we can all understand. In terms of our hunt mission, we frame this, we'll start with some of the specific domain and IP indicators shared through that threat center. So attackers are using this popular toolkit to exfiltrate data to malicious domains and IPs. And because this is network data, we're going to leverage our NetFlow events for this initial hunt mission. All right, also on the Advanced Research Center, you will find some intel. So this is our Intel Insights entry for Cobalt Strike. This comes from our partnership with Intel 471, which is offering some near real-time technical intel on some of the most prevalent families. And it's really meant for you to get a preview of what the full malware intelligence offering would be. But it's definitely worth checking out. I'll put the link to this at the end. So we've got the description here of this Cobalt Strike family and threat. And then when you click on that IOCS tab, you have access to those indicators. And these are getting updated, as I said, in near real time. So we've got a list of IPs and URLs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this data as a kind of sample threat feed that we could use, and it can be a stand-in for any number of other threat feeds, and we'll use this to hunt for the data, that NetFlow data collected in XDR. So I have a training background. I always like to kind of scaffold up our activities. So I'm going to show it manually as you use the UI, and then we'll shift into leveraging the API to automate these tasks and make them much more repeatable. So we're going to jump into the UI. We'll create a list from these indicators and then search our environment. Let me switch over to our XDR dashboard. Now, depending on where you're coming from, your XDR tool will either say Helix or XDR up at the top here. All of what we're showing is going to apply across those tools. It's really just a matter at the moment of which IAM you're coming from. I'm going to jump over here to the lists page. And as this loads, you'll see we have our collection of values and indicators created here. If you're really new to XDR and you're not sure about the UI and haven't moved around it and don't know what lists are, again, I would recommend checking out some of the past webinars in our series on XDR to get a better understanding, because my goal today is to kind of dive in and get technical. So I am going to create a list here, and my list to start is just kind of an initial bucket where I'm going to put my indicators, and I'll call this Cobalt Strike IPs. I'm going to try to spell that right. You can see the short name is generated. It's a lowercase version with no spaces. And then I have the ability to choose a type. Now, any of these types will allow searching. I'm going to search all the data that we've logged already. But moving forward, because I know these IPs are malicious, I can set this up as an Intel match list. And that means moving forward, we'll have detection. So kind of do those hand in hand. And then to start, my list is blank. So I create a list. It's kind of an empty bucket, and I'm going to add indicators to it. Now, this first indicator I'm going to add, kind of just a dummy value that I know exists in my environment. So we have something to find. That's going to be an IP. And for the Cobalt Strike indicators, I think that report put them at medium. So I'll set that as medium, and I'll put this as the insights feed as my source and add my indicator. Now, obviously, as you're working, you don't want to have to add a list of indicators one by one. So in practice, what you would likely do is take this data with the indicators listing all the IP addresses and massage it into a form that has not only the value, we'd add a column for the type, IPv4, the risk, and some notes. And so I've got that populated here. These are my IPs. I just copied those values out, and I've kind of massaged my data. And again, if you have a feed, you're automating this. I'm just kind of showing all the steps that go into it. So I'm going to upload those indicators, and you can see that's populated here. Now, just a note, as you're adding lists, those takes a few minutes for that to actually be populated and usable in your environment. So if we jump into trying to search for it, you might not see anything off the bat. We're going to leverage this short name for my search, and I'm going to search off the destination IPv4. And for any lists, we'll use that $ notation. And I didn't have any matches, again, I think because that data needs to populate, but I don't want this to hold us up. So I'm going to continue on in the presentation. So that's pretty straightforward way to take IOCs that we have from an intel source and leverage them for hunting. We're looking historically at the data that we've seen in our environment to see if we had any hits. And then if we identify any systems, we will take action on those. Now, one of our goals with hunting is to streamline our processes and have it be as automated as possible, or to say that another way, to require the least amount of human interaction except for at those analytical decision points. So I'm going to go through the next batch of intel, which we have. I grabbed the IP addresses, but we also had URL information. And we'll do this part of our hunt through the API. And my goal here is to get you familiar with the API for that XDR console so you can jumpstart your own hunt missions. So the first step is we need to gather and authorize. We'll create an API key with the correct entitlements that we'll need for our hunt mission. And we're going to need to add entitlements for searching and to work with lists, as we just saw. And then depending on any other activities, we would add those. So from our console here, specifically for Helix, we're going to come over to the IAM section. If you work in an instance that is federated, meaning you might have access to more than one environment, once you get into your console, you want to make sure you're in the organization that you expect. And then here under API keys, I'm going to create my key. So I'll click on Create Key, and I'll just call this one Hunting Demo to have a new name. I'll keep this pretty low just for demo purposes. And for the product, the console is actually going to be listed as the Threat Analytics Platform. That's our legacy name, but that's what we are using. So in terms of our entitlements for lists, we want to be able to add them. We want to be able to see what's there. We might want to delete one. We definitely want to edit it and read it. So we'll add all those. Once we have our list, we want to be able to search it. So we're going to add, we might want to save our search. We might want to schedule it. Got a lot of different options here. So we'll add all of those. And then we will create the API key. And you can see that was added successfully. Now at this point, I want to copy that key, and we'll be able to use that. And we'll be able to use that in our API calls. So I'm going to come now back to the console, and we'll come to the API documentation. And we are going to work with the API. We'll start with lists, and I'm going to just search by keyword, and it is not a search list, and it's not an allow list. We've got this search section. So we'll be using the list endpoints. And just to get familiar with it, actually, I got a little bit ahead of myself. So we need to authorize. We'll paste that key here. And that's going to give me the ability to use this Swagger documentation for running my searches. So I've got my list endpoint expanded here. And for many of these, right in this view, we can use the try it out option, and we have the ability to search and sort here. I'm not going to change any of these options. I'm actually just going to execute it. And when we run it from the docs, then we get the curl command, so we can see the endpoint that was used, we get the method, we can see the headers that were required, and specifically we need this X FireEye API key. That's going to give us the authorization. And then we get the sample of the response, which is really useful for kind of deciding how we're going to format that data. So I didn't want to do anything else with this list data. We don't need to do anything by reviewing just yet, but I did want to show that try it out function. And if I collapse this view and I expand the post request here, this is the API that's going to allow us to create our list. And you can see here, we actually don't have the try it out button. So for some of these more complex API endpoints, we don't do it right from here, but we can gather the data we need to do it. So we have the format option, and then we see some example data here, and we have the schema. So for example, this type field is a list type. It's an enumerated list, and we can expand it to see those 3 options for the type of list. And the naming here is whitelist, blacklist, default, which matched the allowed list, the Intel match list, and the default list. So we'll need to keep that in mind. We might need to translate some of the UI. So at this point, one of my favorite tools to use for API is Postman. So I'm going to swap over to that, and I've basically grabbed the data from that Swagger documentation. I got the post request, I've got the address here, and I've added my headers here. So I can start to build out my query. In the body, I just copied and pasted the sample data, and I will build this out a little bit differently. So we'll call this Cobalt Strike Domains. We've got a name here. We'll give it a prettier name. We're going to make it an Intel matching, so that's blacklist in this view, and I'm not going to change any of these others. And let me put in, make sure I have the latest API key here. And so let me send this request. And I must have gotten to a permission issue. Of course, I tested this yesterday, and I don't have the permissions to create this, and I don't want to troubleshoot it while we're running this presentation. So I'm going to come over to my list page here and just create that manually. I'm not sure what's going on. I must have missed a entitlement. So we'll create this list. And I can see from the URL the list ID. So in Postman, I would have expected to get that back from my response. So next, I'm going to move into adding indicators here. I'll change that ID here. And I've got a sample value here. Now, this is just one item. I've got that pre-filled again with this indicators endpoint, or adding the items endpoint from that Swagger. And I think we said that was medium. We'll call this the insights feed, and we'll send that. Now, I should have also mentioned that we are separating out the IPs from the domains because we want to have like items together in our lists. And if I refresh this, we'll see that value here. Now, again, adding these items one by one, not the most time-saving effort here. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine all of these together in a script. Before I do that, let me show the last endpoint we're going to use, which is to query that list of domains. So we're going to use that search endpoint, and in our Swagger docs, we can find the details here. There it is. V1 search. We can find it here in the docs and get details on the viewing searches or creating new searches here. So I've got my search here and I've got my sample data here. The query field is going to contain the TQL search that I want to run. And then I had some default options from the sample. And you'll notice here, because those lists take a minute to populate, I've got a pre-baked version that I created already so that we can get results back. Now I'm going to get all of the events that match this. And so because I have a group by in my results, the piece that I really care about is going to be towards the end here in this aggregations section under the buckets field. And so we've got those keys that have been grouped and the count. So I've got my three pieces. We're going to create a list, add items to it, and then search it to see if we have any matches. And so we're going to bring those all together in a script. I have this search CSV domains, a by source IPv4 already created. And I've got my Cobalt Strike domains downloaded, or I should say, prepped. Got my API key saved here to use. And so let's see what's happening with this script. We'll run the help option here. So we're going to give it a file name of the indicators. We'll give it the list name to create. And then I baked in the search into the script. You could certainly make that a little bit more customizable. So we'll do file with Cobalt Strikes. And again, I'm going to do a sample. I kind of adjusted it to be a shorter list just to take less time. And we're going to do the list name, and we'll call this one Cobalt Strike Domains. And I'm just put a little underscore on the end because I might have practiced this one and I don't want a collision. And that is all I need. So I'm going to run this and you'll see it's created the list. It's adding the entries from that CSV file. I've obviously done a lot of verbose reporting. You could streamline that. And it was a short sample. And then it searches those and it finds hits. Now that's the dummy data that I added, that bad boy server here. So we've taken all of those steps of taking an Intel feed and running a search for it and really made it pretty quick to execute in your environment. All right, so I kept that pretty straightforward using the lists because I wanted to give an opportunity or have an opportunity to talk about the API and get you excited and get you interested and excited to use it. Let's look at extending that hunt mission, right? We're talking about XDR, the extended detection. We don't need to just sit in that console. So let's look at some of the other indicators that are talked about in that Intel report for Cobalt Strike. So we already saw that Cobalt Strike was used in something like 40% of the ransomware infections. Among that 40%, in 87% of that set of cases, rundl32.exe was used. So that was the default process that was spawning sessions in the post-exploitation activity when Cobalt Strike was leveraged. So that's pretty common. So this is another great indicator that if we see this in our environment is going to be an indication that Cobalt Strike is being used. And specifically, if we see rundll spawning other processes or listed as the parent of other processes, that is going to be really useful information. So now we're going to search our Windows data, our endpoint data. Well, how are we going to do that? If we have process events aggregated in XDR console to search, we've got our sysmon events or 4688, that becomes really easy. But we might not have that aggregated data across our entire endpoint population because that's that could be a potentially very large data set. So let's look at how else we could get that data with the endpoint piece of XDR, whether that's endpoint security HX, if you're coming from the from that side of the house, or if you've coming from the Trellix EDR side, you can leverage that tool to search your endpoint data. Now, for the purpose of this webinar, we have a short amount of time. I'm going to pick one. So I'm going to use Endpoint Security HX for the demo. And with Endpoint Security HX, we can search either recorded EDR events like processes that were run, file write activities, registry key changes related to persistence, or if we don't want to limit ourselves to searching just what the agent has recorded, we can run what we call an exhaustive search, which is going to gather more detailed artifacts. And when we get into that option, I'll show you kind of the some of what the considerations are. Now, if you're totally new to Endpoint Security HX, as I mentioned, this is we're part of a series of webinars, and there was a webinar, I mentioned it earlier, demystifying enterprise search that you might want to check out. It goes into a lot of detail about what you can collect and how you decide. So just as we did with the aggregated log data, we can do this through the UI or we can do it through the API. At this point, I'm going to move even quicker through my demo just to get you kind of familiar with what you might be doing if you're going to sweep this endpoint data. So we'll start in the UI and then I'll show you the API option for collecting this data. Remember, we're looking for that run DLL32.exe. So from our UI here, we're going to move into our endpoint data. And again, whichever tool you're using, you'll have the option from the menu to move through your data. As I said, for our purposes today, we're using Endpoint Security HX. And once this loads here, we're going to leverage enterprise search. So from the UI, if we know what we're looking for, it's pretty straightforward to run our search. So I'm going to look for process name equals, and then just to verify, it was run DLL32.exe. Now, if I'm running on process name, I do have the option to enable exhaustive search. So the agent records process activity, but depending on my deployment, maybe I have the agent deployed on a bunch of servers so that is not where the servers are not collecting those agent events. In that case, I'd want to enable exhaustive search, and the agent on every single system it's installed on is going to query the operating system and then return back the processes that are running. And that would take a little bit longer, but it could be more thorough. The other option that I have is to not check that box and leverage the agent events. And when I do that, instead of looking just for this run DLL32.exe, I could actually jump to looking for the parent process name, because the agent records not only processes that were run, but the kind of hierarchy in the parents that were related. So if I see run DLL32 spawning a command shell or other processes, that's going to give me some really great insight into what's happening. And you'll see with this parent process name, I don't have that exhaustive search option because that agent collection gives me this visibility. So I'm going to stick with this configuration, parent process name equals run DLL32.exe, and I'm going to search my environment here, and that's going to take some time to start to collect my results back, right? So in the console, all that data had been aggregated, and I'm running Elasticsearch. I'm getting all that data really super quick. With the sweep of endpoints, this takes a little bit more time because we're having the agent collect that data, but it's a really thorough sweep in our environment. Now, in this particular HX instance, I don't think I staged any data to look at. So let's hop over to a different instance of HX that I have. And I've set up this search to run already here. And so I've got my, I think here I did parent process name. Okay, there we go. So I had 5 results back. A lot of these systems are not on. That's why we have so many not responded. And so here we can see the systems that matched the process that ran. And here we've got the process name is run DLL32. And so I could look for, notable processes where run DLL32 was the parent process. Now I had 5 systems that match. So these are kind of like 5 hits to my hunt mission, but it's depending on the search. I couldn't, say with high fidelity that this was Cobalt Strike running. I would probably need a little bit more information. Might need to do an acquisition from the host. We infect a lot of fun stuff in this lab, so I'm not exactly sure what was used. I'm pretty sure it's malicious. I just don't know what the specific culprit was. All right, so let me jump back now to the this HX in the cloud. That's part of our XDR ecosystem here, and we looked at that hunt mission, executing that sweep using the UI. We can do the same thing using the API. And that's going to be under our API documentation module. That's an add-on. So if you don't have it, just from the module administration page, you can browse and install it. And essentially, it just gives you access to working with these APIs right in the tool. And for our hunting activities, we're going to be using the Lighthouse APIs, which are going to allow enterprise search, acquisitions, and some other stuff kind of related to the common analyst activities. And so now that I'm on my Lighthouse APIs, the first piece is I need to authenticate. And here with HX, we're not going to use the token that we had from XDR. We're actually going to get a token, a short-term token to use. And hopefully I typed that correctly. So I've got my password in here, and the first is I'll just get a token. And all of our APIs work, we describe it, we have the example, and you can try it. And I did get my 204 response, so that was successful. And I'm going to grab my token to use for the rest of my searches. And so we'll clear the password and we'll authenticate with a token. So if you were scripting this, you just kind of script it this way. This token is going to be valid for the next 2.5 hours as long as I'm using it actively. If I stop using it for more than 15 minutes, it'll time out. So we are going to use that search API, and I'm going to jump. This documentation works just in the same vein as the other the documentation for those other endpoints. So I'm going to jump right here to post, and we're going to set up our search. And we can either search on a group of hosts, right? So we can define a set of hosts, or maybe we'll want all hosts, and that ID is 101. And so since I'm doing the host set, I'm not going to do a specific host. It's got to be one or the other. And I'm not building an indicator. I'm running a search. So actually, I'm going to get rid of all of this. Just make sure I felt like I deleted a little too much. So host set and query. And our field we said was parent process name equals, and then we wanted run dll32.exe. And hopefully I got that all right. Let me run that. Oh, there we go. And now it's running, and my ID is 50. Now with this sweep, we expect this is going to take a little bit more time. So if we're scripting this, we'll want to kind of pause and iterate and check on the status. And we'll use this searches ID endpoint to check on the status. So I've got that value popped in here, and I'll hit try, and we can see it's running. And if I scroll down here, it's going to show me the state. So I haven't yet had any responses, which matches what we saw in the UI, because I don't think there's a lot of that data in this particular environment. So we could just we'd kind of periodically check on this till we had more results and all of the endpoints responding back. We may occasionally have systems that are offline or someone's on vacation, and so they're not going to check in. So we don't necessarily need to look for like 100% of a rate. I think looking for about 90% would probably give you good coverage and understanding. So you'll just kind of query that until you've got your level of completeness, and then take those results from there. So once, as we worked, I showed in more detail working with those lists APIs, these APIs for sweeping, function similarly. If you've ever done API scripting, it doesn't take long with the documentation to get in and get started. So I hope that gives you some good insight. So we covered a lot today, and there is a lot that you can do with XDR and hunt missions. I've just chosen one sample to try to give you a glimpse of the ways that we can streamline those operations, both with the features within the product and with the APIs. So I hope that was helpful to you all. As I mentioned, I come from our training group, and so I do want to put a quick plug in for our cyber threat hunting training. If you are newer to hunting, this class covers the fundamentals of cyber threat hunting. So while I glossed over, defining your hunt missions and actions, that is certainly all covered in a great amount of detail there. How to build a hunt program, how to identify and define and execute a hunt mission. So you might want to check that out. We've got public offerings, so you can schedule this. I think we run it once a quarter. If you have a solid hunt program and you really just want to get more hands-on with the XDR tools, I would recommend the Investigations with XDR class. That's kind of more hands-on technical with the console and endpoint tools for you to get experience to get super fast with the tool so you can work on those hunt missions. We've got some links here put together. Most of these I mentioned previously, I mentioned these throughout the presentation, so I want to make sure you have access to those. And I want to thank you so much for your time and attention today, and we're going to move into Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sarah. As a reminder for everyone, Trellix Education Services offers exceptional training to go along with our award-winning products. If you would like to learn more, please visit the website listed on your screen to see all of our offerings. Now let's get our Q&A session started. I see we have several questions, but it's not too late to add your question. Please type it in the Q&A window to submit. Additionally, take a moment to fill out the survey. Your feedback and suggestions are always appreciated. We had a few questions around the links that we showed during the presentation. I just want to confirm that you will receive the links to the Advanced Research Center, the ARC Insights preview, as well as the main webinars page, along with the recording of this session within 24 hours after the webinar ends. What is the pricing model for ingesting the additional logs into the XDR platform outside of the Trellix native products?
So the pricing model is really designed around the volume of storage they're using. And we find actually that many customers don't always kind of use the full overhead that they have. So it doesn't necessarily cost more to send more different sources. It's really going to be about the volume. So the number one action I'd recommend is in Helix on the, if you navigate to the operational dashboard, there's a widget there that shows you your EPS or events per second over time. And there's a line running across the top that will show your contracted usage. And so if you're under that by a bit, you can see what your averages are. And you may find you have some volume of events that you're just not taking advantage of. And so you can configure data sources and not have any change to pricing. If you identify additional data sources that would be really useful, then obviously we can tune your contracted EPS up.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you have any tips on how to hunt against the public cloud infrastructure?
So if we're hunting, in the XDR solution, we didn't cover in this training, but configuring those cloud data sources to send data to Helix is actually really straightforward. We do that through a function right in the XDR console under the configure menu. It's called Cloud Connect. So you need to integrate that data so you have access to it. And then, kind of following the same methodology of identifying what it is that you want to hunt for, is it unauthorized access? Is it, you name it. And then you need to have that data coming in. We do have really great detection also built in terms of with our AWS connections, we have those analytic engines that are looking for anomalies there. So definitely a fruitful connection and set of data to have within the tool.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one. Can I replace my SIM for the XDR Trellix solution?
Yeah, in terms of the console, and we didn't spend a lot of time really in that today, but a lot of the features right in that console reflect kind of traditional SIM capabilities. And with XDR, we're really trying to take that and extend that and make your actions reaching out into other tools more seamless. So yeah, 100%, that would be an avenue to explore.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one as well. We have another question around the two EDR products in use and supported with Envision EDR and Helix. Do you know if those will be consolidated at some point into one EDR tool? And do you have any idea around the timeline for that?
Yeah, David, 100%. We are working very hard towards a unified endpoint solution. While that engineering effort occurs, we are also working towards, putting out and making it easy to understand how those tools can work together. So for example, with the X agent, and I showed there's some really powerful forensics capabilities that complement what the Envision agent does. And so we've been adding deployment guides to our knowledge base for which settings you want to enable when you have them side by side. So that's kind of the current state of the land. Is our endpoint solution does incorporate those two products with those two separate agents. And yes, we're moving towards that unified agent. I don't have a concrete timeline that I can discuss on that, but it is like a top of mind effort for sure.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you for that one as well. It looks like that's all the questions that we had for today's session. I want to thank everyone for joining today's webinar, and a big thank you to our speaker, Sarah. As a reminder, a link to today's recorded presentation will be emailed to all registered attendees. This concludes today's webinar. Stay safe, everyone.